Great. Thank you. Okay, so we're working our way through Ezra and Nehemiah. And what we did last week is we went through this sort of plan that Nehemiah had. He is in Babylon. He's one of the Jews that did not return from Babylon. And here it is many years later, and he realizes that he has an opportunity. And the opportunity is to approach the king because he has access to the king. Remember, he was the cupbearer. And he goes into the king, and he is passionate for his people, and the king allows him to return to Jerusalem. And so we spent some time last week talking about the prayer that Nehemiah offered, talking about how he was passionate about the people in Israel, how he immediately prayed to his God at the drop of a hat. He's called before the king, and it says that he offers a prayer. There's no time to bow on his knees. There's no time for a formal prayer. He was always in prayer to God, it seemed. And I think one of the lessons that we talked about was this idea that we are to pray continually. And it seems like that's something that Nehemiah was doing. And so now what we're finding is the king is allowing him to return to Jerusalem. And again, we see great favor being paid not only to the Jews who had previously returned, but now also to Nehemiah, and that the king is giving him financial wherewithal to get back there. And so he's going back, and the purpose of him going back is to rebuild the walls. And you remember last week we found that Nehemiah's brother comes to him and tells him about the difficulty that is still going on in Jerusalem these many, many years later. And he seems shocked. He seems surprised that the walls of Jerusalem are still broken down. These were the walls that were destroyed. We read about it at the end of 2nd Chronicles when the Babylonians came in. They destroyed everything by fire. And so what we're going to find is that once he gets back and sets his mind and through prayerful action, the temple walls, the walls rather around the city, are built in but 52 days. So it's been years. And in 52 days, they get these walls repaired. Now, I ended last week with this slide just because I found it really interesting. When I think about Jerusalem, much of what I think about has to do with Herod's temple, because I think that's what we see with the wall, the Western Wailing Wall. We've done a lot of studies here in the Ecclesia about the temple. But that's not the temple that Nehemiah was working on. It was much smaller in scale. And so on this page here, we're seeing two different time periods. The first on the left is the city of David. This was very early on, and we have a very small city here where this is what we're talking about. And we begin to see David's palace, but there's no temple. Remember, David's palace was built first, and it was only after David that Solomon came and began to construct the temple. And so on this page here, this is what it likely looked like in the days of Nehemiah, certainly after Solomon built the temple. We've got the same city of David here, but then north on this Temple Mount, we see the temple being built. This Temple Mount, of course, is where the Dome of the Rock is in Jerusalem today. But this is where the temple of Yahweh was built by David's son. And if we turn now to this, we see a comparison between the days of Nehemiah and the days of Jesus. This is what I've always sort of viewed in my mind as what the Jerusalem looked like, but this is a more modern Jerusalem. And if you look, you can see here, this was the city of David. Just this small section here. Can you see that? And it's in the times of Jesus, the city has grown. The Temple Mount, obviously, is huge. This is the mount that Herod had built. And so what happens is we're going back in time, and we're realizing that the walls have been destroyed. The Babylonians destroyed those walls. Let's just look at 2 Chronicles chapter 36 as a review. This is the last chapter of 2 Chronicles. Must be long chapters in Chronicles. I think I've turned the page 1,000 times. Here we go. I'm going to have you look at verse 15. The Lord, the God of their father, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. And so these prophets that we're reading about here, or the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, they came before and they encouraged the people to turn back to God, and they ignored them. Verse 17, he, God, brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, spared neither young man nor young woman, old man or aged. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. And now what we're going to see is five different things that Nebuchadnezzar did to the people of Jerusalem and to Jerusalem itself. First, verse 18, he carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple and the treasures of the king's officials. It's the first thing he did. He ransacked the temple. He took all of the gold that was in the temple and he carried it back. And you remember in the days of Ezra, the king allowed Ezra to bring much of this back with him to Jerusalem. So the first thing we see in verse 18 is the ransacking of the temple. The second thing we see is in verse 19, they set fire to the temple. And they broke down the wall. That's the third thing. The fourth thing, they burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. And then lastly, in verse 20, he carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword. So this was a horrible event in the nation of Israel. And we're seeing through the course of Ezra and Nehemiah, the rebuilding. Now, brothers and sisters, there are times in our lives when the walls seem to fall down, aren't there? There are times when life is difficult. And what we're going to see, one of the lessons we see here in Ezra and Nehemiah, is that it's a lesson not to give up. It's a lesson that we can rebuild our lives with godly prayer. We can rebuild our lives with godly effort. And I think that's what we're seeing here in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and in Esther too. Even in the face of great opposition, God loves us. God is for us. In the New Testament, as baptized brothers and sisters in Christ, we have a high priest who lives to intercede on our behalf. This is how much love God has for us. So that when you think the walls are falling down in your life, you need to remember to get going. We can do it with God's help. Jim, what's the verse you put on the bottom of all of your emails? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, right? Yeah. And so it's not that we can do it. It's that we can do it through Christ who strengthens us. We can do it with God's blessing. And so Nehemiah Brick Company got to work, and they started building the wall again. It had been years, it had been generations. So turn to Nehemiah chapter 2, and I'd like for us to spend some time this morning going through chapters 2 through chapter 6. And while you turn there, let me just show you this picture on the screen. This is a picture that Brother Lane Rittmeyer had posted at some point. And it's a picture of an archaeological dig right near the David's Palace. And Brother Lane has identified these stones in this wall as the repairs that were likely done during the days of Nehemiah. So the things that we're reading about here in Scripture are historical events. These are things that actually happened. These are brothers and sisters of ours. These are Jews who, without leather gloves, picked up these stones and moved these buildings, these boulders, and constructed and repaired that wall. Anybody ever build a stone wall? Yeah? What's it like?
Not fun.
It's not fun. It's not fun. How many pairs of gloves did you go through?
A bunch.
Yeah. I mean, makes you wonder what the equipment that we have today compared to the equipment they have. Did they have leather gloves? I have no idea. But Sandy, you built a stone wall at our old house. I remember building walls, and your fingers would be killing you. These are things that actually people did. So we're in Nehemiah chapter 2. And let's look then at verse 4. King said to me, this is what we looked at last week, what is it that you want? And then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah, where my fathers are buried, so I can rebuild it. This was his goal. And when we come to verse 8, we see that goal is starting to be realized. He says, may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he'll give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I'll occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. And the king also sent army officers and cavalry with me. This is something that didn't happen with Ezra. Remember, when Ezra went back, he went without an armed guard, despite bringing so much riches with him. And Nehemiah is now returning. He's coming with the king's letter, but he's also he's coming with a lot of money. The king has given him a lot of things to bring back. You're going to see later how Nehemiah, he provided for the poor and the suffering that were in Jerusalem. Where did he get that money? It came from the king. Nehemiah had a party in which he invited all of the officials. Who paid for that? It came from the king. And so it was necessary, from the king's perspective, to send cavalry to accompany Nehemiah, to protect him on the way from those that might try and rob him and rob his band of returning exiles. Verse 9. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, gave them the king's letters. The king also sent me an army of officers and cavalry with me. Verse 11. I went to Jerusalem. So he's finally, after 1,000 miles of hoofing it through the desert, he gets to Jerusalem. And after staying there 3 days, verse 12, I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me, except the one I was riding. Why is it, do you think, Nehemiah went out at night? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Pray.
To pray?
Nobody could see what he was doing.
So nobody could see what he was doing. I think that's probably it, Jim.
No.
I think he wanted to scope out the scale of the problem before he came up with any, solutions. He was preparing to present this objective to the people. Remember, he's been there 3 days. It'd be like somebody walking in the door of our ecclesia saying, hey, guess what? I've joined the Boston Ecclesia. And then on the first Sunday saying, okay, brothers and sisters, here's what we're going to do different now. It wouldn't go over very well, would it? And so I think what Nehemiah has done is he's gone out at night, he's quietly explored and examined the problem, and he's preparing to present a solution to the people. Why? I think he anticipates that there might likely be opposition. Why would there be opposition? Well, it's been a long time and nothing's been done. But historically, we saw in Ezra's day, we saw when, not Sanballat, who was the first exile? Shezbo, I can't remember his name. When the first Jeshua came back, and they experienced opposition from the nations around them. And I think Nehemiah was anticipating the same thing. So he's getting all his ducks in order. He's preparing this presentation to make to the people. And he goes out at night. And by night, I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem. Skip down to the 16th verse. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who were doing the work. He's preparing, getting his ducks in a row. Verse 17, then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in? We, right? I mean, that's the great thing about Nehemiah and Ezra and so many of these leaders. He doesn't say, see the trouble you're in. He includes himself in the issue. Do you see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we'll no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. And so they began this good work. So he's got his ducks in a row. He makes his presentation to the people. He does it in a way where he is including himself in the problem. It's not those people. It's not you guys. It's us. And I think that's a great lesson for us. When we speak about the ecclesia, when we speak about the brotherhood at large, we ought to avoid using the expression, those people, and we need to include ourselves in these things. We are in it together. We are the one body of Christ. And consequently, we can learn a lesson from Nehemiah. Verse 20. After they said, let's start rebuilding, verse 20, he answered them and said, the God of heaven will give us success. Comments or questions so far?
Do you think they knew who he was? Knew that he was a cupbearer and a big important role?
Oh, I don't know, Sandy. Yeah. I mean, they must have known that he was... I mean, he came back with, a cavalry, and with all these... I mean, he must have been recognized as being somebody of importance. And then when he says, doesn't he say it, didn't we just read where he talked about how God would, I told him everything God had done for me?
Yeah.
Verse 18, I also told him about the gracious hand my God was upon me and what the king said to me. So I think that there is the implication there that, yeah, they would have known who he was. Yeah, they would have known that he was, the right-hand man to the king. Now, remember, again, from a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how is it that these people could be at such a high position in the land? How is it that a Jew who was in captivity just 2 generations ago can now be in a position where he is second in command in a foreign country? And do you remember how we answered that? Why is it, do you think, Nehemiah was at this level?
He was talking about Mordecai, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, right.
See, all of these books are all intermingled, interlocked. So we've got Ezra, and we have Esther, and we have Nehemiah. They all took place at the same time. And so when in the book of Esther we read about the Jews being threatened with annihilation, and we see Mordecai coming on the scene, and Mordecai provided great favor, spoke with great favorable words about the Jews. It elevated him to a position. Mordecai was second in command, and his good work, his good example probably would have allowed Nehemiah to come up shortly thereafter. Yeah, Ray.
I think of it more as God's hand involved as it parallels Joseph in Egypt.
Yeah.
And how this is all God's plan to raise him to that level.
No doubt, for sure. Yep. Yep. Okay, so now we're in chapter 3. And what we're going to see in chapter 3 is the rebuilding of the walls. And I have a small map here. And if you'd like a copy of this, I could, I suppose, make a printout. There are 12 gates that they began to rebuild. And so between each gate, there's a section of wall. And there were 46 building crews that Nehemiah sent out. And we're going to read about that here in chapter 3. It says in verse 1, Eliashib the high priest and his fellow servants went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. Verse 3, the fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassaniah. Verse 6, the Jeshanah gate was repaired by Jehoiada, son of Peshan. The valley gate, verse 13, was repaired by Hanan. And so all along they have put these 46 building crews together, these building parties together, and they are rebuilding initially the gates of the wall. And then they're going to start to fill in between the gates where the walls had been destroyed, where the walls had been knocked down and burned. A couple of points to bring out in this particular chapter. The first is in verse 2. The men of Jericho, not Jerusalem, Jericho. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing people from all over Israel descend, or ascend rather, to Jerusalem to help out in the work. It's like Brother Jim Boyko getting in his truck and going up to Manitoulin Island for the work camp, right? I mean, we are a community of believers, and we are to work together for the building and the strengthening of God's people. And so the people here were doing the same. The men from Jericho were coming up to Jerusalem to rebuild. And the workers included people from all different areas. So we see that in verse 2, the men of Jericho. If we come down to verse 7, it says, next to them, repairs were made by the men from Gibeon and Mizpah and Melatiah of Gibeon and Jadon of Meronoth, places under the authority of the governor of Trans-Euphrates. Again, so it's not just Jericho, it's Mizpah and these other cities. Verse 13, they rebuilt it and put it, the valley gate was repaired by Hanan and the residents of Zanoah. So again, we're seeing many, many people from all over Israel coming together for the common cause of rebuilding this great city. So not only was it that they came from many different areas, they also came from many different walks of life. We're seeing that the people who participated in the rebuilding weren't just the lowly workers. Everyone had a hand. Nobody was above the work. We're going to see that priests were involved. We're going to see that noblemen were involved. Women were involved. Of course, craftsmen were involved, and merchants were involved. Everybody from all different walks of life took part. It was that important to all the people. And I think what a great lesson for us, you know, that we can build together. You know, think about the time when we were rebuilding, you know, the basement, and everybody came together to work. You know, it was a joyous time. And I think there are lots of examples of that throughout the scriptures. But let's take a look at all these people. Verse 1 of chapter 3, we read about the high priest and his fellow priests who went to work. So there we see the priest. It's not just there in the first verse, but the 22nd verse, it says the repairs next to them were made by the priests. We see the priests also working in the 28th verse, where it says, above the horse gate, the priests made repairs. So here we have the priests working. And if you look at the 5th verse, we see noblemen working. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but it says, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. I wonder what that means. Say it again? Yeah, you know, here I am preparing all these notes. I should read more carefully. It says they wouldn't put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. Does anybody have a different version of that?
What verse is this, Steve?
It's chapter 3, verse 5.
I would put there, nobles,
The ESV says would not stoop to serve their Lord.
and put not their necks to the work of their Lord.
Huh. Well, never mind. That sort of blew that whole section. Everybody worked together except the noblemen. All right. Verse 12. Shalem, son of Halanish, ruler of the Has district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section with the help of his daughters. So we see the daughters working in conjunction. Craftsman in verse 8. Uziel, son of Haraiah, one of the goldsmiths, repaired the next section. And on it goes. I think that's a, yeah, Jim.
I was going to say, it does show, that line in verse 5, it does show you that it is a unified effort, but even if there's one or two people who are fighting against it, it can still get done.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's always that case, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just the human element, right?
Yeah. And I think that's really important, Jim, yeah. Because, there's a part of us that would say, well, until everybody's on board, we're not going to move ahead.
Right.
And yet, the work was that important that they began the work. And the presumption I have is that they began the work hoping that these noblemen would eventually come on, maybe.
I wonder what nobleman represents.
Yeah.
It doesn't represent the priest, because we can see the priests are working.
Yeah.
I wonder what nobleman represents.
So, yeah, right.
I think it represents arrogance and blindness.
Yeah. Certainly, you see a sense of arrogance if they refuse to put their hand together. Now, it uses the word Lord. I don't think that Lord there is referring to God. Would have been in capital letters. It's referring to their supervisor, their boss, their owner.
Seems to me that they,
Yeah.
once they overcome the stigma of having to rely upon the new leadership. The nobles were noble because under the old leadership. Now they've got these new people telling them what to do.
Maybe.
Once they experience the success of this, I think we'll see an inclusion.
That makes a lot of sense to me. That, if the noblemen were not only arrogant, but perhaps they were feeling that their authority was being usurped by Nehemiah, who's now this new guy in town, saying, "This is what we're going to do, everybody. Let's get on board." And they might say, "Who is this guy?" That makes sense to me, Dad.
Yeah.
Okay. So chapter 3 really gives this description of all of those that are rebuilding. And then in chapter 4, Jim, we pick up on the same idea that you mentioned, where the work goes on even when there are some in the community that aren't in favor. Here in chapter 4, we find some outside the community who provide opposition. Chapter 4, verse 1. You know what? Before we go to chapter 4, verse 1, let's just look over at verse 17. I wanted to make this point. Chapter 3, verse 17. Again, talking about the repairs, it says, "Next to him, the repairs were made by the Levites under Raham, son of Bani. Beside him, Hasabiah, ruler of the half district of Keilah, carried out repairs for his district." That's the point I want to emphasize. Carried out repairs for his district. And throughout the rebuilding, it seems as though Nehemiah would give the responsibility for a section of the wall to those that lived near the wall. They had a vested interest. They had a passionate desire to rebuild the section that was nearest them. And again, I think that can be a great example. There was a study that I was reading something about Google this week, and how it was a report on productivity. And Google as a company is one of the most productive companies around, they say. They hire incredibly brilliant men and women to work there. They also have they have a common goal that allows them to get more work done. And Harvard Business Review came in and they were exploring why it was that Google was so much more productive than others. And one of the reasons they said was because everybody on the team had a real interest in the goal of that particular team. And if you might have a brilliant person, but if he's put on the wrong team with the wrong objective, he's going to go through the motions maybe. And from an ecclesial standpoint, I think about the ecclesial standpoint. Kathy's not here, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Sister Kathy. Kathy has a passion for visiting, doesn't she? And, that's not my strong point. It really isn't. And so if I were put in charge of, the visiting committee, I'd really struggle with it. I could make excuses. I don't have the time, or I'm, running my business, or, all of these things. But if I had a passion for it, I'd find the time. Kathy has a passion for it. I have a passion for teaching. I love to teach. And so, that's where I put my time. And each one of you has a passion for something. Everybody in our ecclesia has a passion for something. And if we can, as we see here in Nehemiah, have people who are passionate about building this section of the wall, have them work on that section instead of this section, how much more we can get accomplished. And if, I think the lesson for us is that, if there's something that you are really passionate about, and you're doing something other than that, find a way into doing the things that you're passionate about. Tell people. Say, how can I do this? How can I get involved in that? Or conversely, if you're in an area where you're struggling and you think that, Kathy would be great doing this, or Gail would be great doing this, bring them on, bring them in. And I think that's what Google does. When they're working in these committees, they will find people that are passionate about that particular job. And those are the ones that will work in that committee. That's, I think, what was happening here.
Was it Nehemiah that selected the teams?
I don't remember. I don't know how the teams were selected. Does anybody know? Any comments about the ecclesia, about, sort of working as a team?
This chart makes me think of Paul talking about the body. Now there's different parts to the body.
Yeah.
And how they have to work all together. I mean,
Yeah.
You think the group.
So in other words, the dung gate would be the lesser parts of the body?
Yeah, exactly. Man, we got the dung gate. You got to have a dung gate.
Yeah. Somebody's got to clean the toilets.
Somebody's got to clean the toilets. That's right.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, so chapter 4 is where we see this outside opposition coming. Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, and he became angry and greatly incensed, and he ridiculed the Jews in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria. And he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" It's just sarcasm and ridicule. He's just leveling it on. But the work was divinely blessed. And the work was going to continue despite the opposition. They overcame the opposition. And so what happens is when these people are ridiculing the Jews are taking it in, but they're praying to God rather than retaliating on their own. Verse 3, Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they're building, if even a fox climbed on it, he'd break down the wall with their stones." Ha, 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 ha. Bunch of jerks. Right? Verse 4, they pray, "Hear us, O God, for we are despised." Now, some of the prayers in the Old Testament really they seem to fall short of sort of the Christian attitude towards prayer. There's the psalmists talk about these imprecatory prayers where they are praying that God will do something to that guy. And that's what we're reading here. "Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as a plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So their prayer was that, their curses would fall back on them. But in a way, isn't that what the promises to Abraham were about? I will bless those that bless thee and curse those that curse thee. And Nehemiah and Ezra too were fully aware and completely understood the Jewish scriptures. Perhaps that's why the prayer came across the way it does. That they knew that God would bless those that bless them and curse those that curse them. And so they were praying that God would do just that.
You think there was external pressure from the people around them, ridiculing them, but you had mentioned earlier that there was probably internal pressure from among those who had married foreign wives.
Right?
Associated with
Foreign women.
foreign women.
Dwelling to foreign women. Yeah.
And that might have resulted in an internal struggle that Nehemiah had to overcome
Right.
with his own building team.
Right. That's right. So we see this opposition. It started with ridicule. It led to violence in verse 8. They all plotted together, the enemies, to come and fight against Jerusalem and to stir them up, to stir up trouble against it. Verse 14. This is Nehemiah. Verse 13. I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. And after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles and officials and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, and your daughters, your wives, and your homes. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to his own work. Okay? People were sword in one hand, trowel in the other. And they didn't stop building despite the opposition. Now, we're out of time, so let me just end with this. There are great lessons in this book for us. One of the lessons is that the wall was a visual reminder for the people to remain separate from the world. It was a reminder. And this was an issue because when we looked at Ezra, we saw that the people were, as it said, giving dwelling to foreign women. They were marrying foreign wives, perhaps, or they were living with foreign women. And this was a problem because they were to be separate. And so one of the slides, this is a slide from one of our early classes in the book of Ezra, and we are talking about how, from the very beginning, God created separation. He separated the light from the darkness. We came to 2 Corinthians chapter 6 several weeks ago, and we talked about how we're not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers, whether that's in business or in marriage or in our daily affairs. We need to remain separate. We are a holy, a separate people. Ezra chapter 9, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land and their abominations. And so the wall was a visual reminder of the need to separate from the world. But the other thing to remember, brothers and sisters, is the wall went around Jerusalem. It didn't go through it. There was no division within the city of Jerusalem. They weren't looking at the priests and the Levites who had separated and saying, we're going to kick them out. They kept them all in together. Unity was an important thing. And the reason is what we're going to see next. What happens next is Ezra comes and he builds this tower from which he can preach the gospel, where he can teach the people about the law. If they had built the wall through the city and they kept those who were prayerful and those who were upright separate from those in the city who had not been that way, those people would never hear the law. When Ezra spoke and delivered this message to the people, if they were outside that wall because they thought those people are worldly, they'd never hear the proper teaching. And I think in this day and age, with the growing schism, that's an important thing to remember. We are one body. We are together so that we can develop a unity of mind and purpose. And I think that's one of the lessons that we see here from the story and the life of Ezra and Nehemiah. We're out of time.